KDKR programming do not necessarily reflect the views of this station, its management, or staff.
Prudent Money with Bob Brooks is sponsored by the Prudent Money Foundation on 91.3.
Well, is the economy going to implode? Today we're going to take a look. Stay tuned for Prudent Money. Good afternoon and welcome to the Prudent Money Radio Show. I'm your host, Bob Brooks. Thank you so much for joining me today. You know I do appreciate it. Well, economic conditions are shaky and there's a good percentage chance a recession appears before the end of the year. So the question comes up, is the economy about to implode? Well, today, Crown CEO Chuck Bentley is with me today to give his take. Chuck, always good to get the opportunity to talk to you.
Thank you, Bob. It's always my honor. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of your program.
You know, it's kind of funny being on the end that you and I are as far as we look at these things every day. We talk to people about finances. We follow what's going on in the economy, and it's like kind of ask the weatherman if it's going to rain. You know, is the economy about to implode?
Are you asking me like the weatherman, Bob?
Maybe not the weatherman. I probably could have gotten a better example than that. But you know, it's like you guys are tied into all this information. When's it going to implode?
I get asked that all the time, especially since Larry Burkett, our founder, wrote a book called The Coming Economic Earthquake. He wrote that book in 1991, and he really felt like it would implode by the turn of the century or by 2000. So he gave it about a 9-year runway, and he was wrong. He missed it completely, and people were unhappy about that. And the fact is, nobody knows the future. The weatherman doesn't know the future. Larry didn't. I don't. And so we have to be very careful. I really like what Yogi Berra said. It's very difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. So, you know, I don't think it's going to implode. I think that Larry gave it a lot of careful thought. He put out some benchmarks to watch for. Those could be considered his view of the gray swans that I've written about. But I don't think we're on the verge of the big one, as people say. Is this going to be the one that we can't recover from? My view is I think we are, but I do believe there are things we need to be watching for. And as you always say, Bob, we need to be prudent.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are, you know, it's more of the question is, what could I do to reduce risk in my life? I mean, I think if you think that at some point down the road the economy is going to run into a recession, run into a problem, it's all, you know, Chuck, I think it's all about what are the steps I can take so that if this does happen, I'll be okay.
I think that's a great way to look at it, just to be very practical and to say, what does God say about that? Because he does say that if you build your house on the rock or on the sand, you're both going to get the storm. You're not storm exempt, right? You're going to feel the pressure of the storm, but one of those will survive the storm. And I believe the financial principles that he gives us, that's what's meant by building your house on the rocks. For instance, if you're going into a recession without debt, you're not nearly as concerned as the guy who's highly, highly leveraged. If you're going into a recession with a savings, you're not nearly as concerned as the 60% of our population living paycheck to paycheck. If you go into a recession and you have diversification of your investments so that some of those investments benefit from a downturn, you're not nearly as concerned as those who are not paying attention. And so building your house on the rock is not a guarantee that you won't suffer or that you won't have challenges, but you will endure a storm. And God's principles are there to prepare for a storm. It's hard to survive a storm if you don't start before the storm.
Right.
And what you're trying to say to people is, let's start early. Let's have a plan in place so that when the storms do come, which they will come, then you're ready for them and you've built your financial house on the rock.
I'd never sat down and read Larry's book. I do somewhere in my library have a copy of it, and it was interesting as I was looking through what some of his main points were in that book back in the early 90s. I thought he is so way ahead of his time. I mean, these are things that are happening today. And we're starting to see, warning signs, red flags. Let's talk a little bit about some of this, because I think that this is something that a lot of people don't know to look for. And one of the first things he talked about in the book was once the limit to which foreign investors will fund the U.S. debt is reached, a monetary crisis is not far off. So in other words, when we can't depend upon other countries to lend us money, really is what
that's right.
We have a problem. And talk about how kind of far into those relationships we really already are in debt wise.
Bob, I like to think of economics as the study of human behavior.
Yes.
Most people think it's a study of numbers, but the fact is money tells us what people think because their behavior is an indication of their belief system. So if you think about how do people behave with money, then Larry just gave his view of what would happen. And he believed that we would become more and more debt dependent, which we are. A third of our budget is supplied by debt every year, year after year after year. We don't live on a balanced budget. We live beyond our means. So he knew that there may be a time when foreign investors didn't want U.S. debt. They would just quit buying it. They would quit buying U.S. savings bonds. They wouldn't trust us anymore. And so he said that's when it's over. That's when you can't sustain an economy living on vapor. So that was the thing he said to watch for. Now, right now, what's making people nervous is that China is trying to replace the U.S. dollar as a reserve currency of the world, and they're making agreements with Russia and I think now possibly Brazil and some Middle Eastern countries to start using their currency as a reserve currency. Well, they only have 3% of the market. U.S. still has 60% of the market.
Right.
So, it sounds threatening. And it is somewhat threatening, but it's kind of that ankle-biting threatening. It's making a lot of noise. It's not a real significant threat at this point. That was his first point to watch for, and I think it's a good one. But I don't want to buy Chinese bonds, and I'm sure you're not recommending other people buy them either.
Right. I think too what makes the situation a little bit more sensationalized is that you have all these people who are writing newsletters, selling newsletter subscriptions, and sending out these viral emails and videos that are just fanning the flame of fear, if you will.
Yeah.
And that didn't help things at all.
Well, marketers know that two things cause people to change their behavior, fear or greed. And if you find somebody preying on either one of those, I would run from them because they're the ones who are manipulating.
Let's talk about the second one. Government will monetize their debt. I think this word monetize is something that people have heard the term used, maybe don't really understand what it really means. Talk a little bit about that.
It means that the government will print money to pay off its own debt. And it may look good on the balance sheet. It may look good that, the debt's being reduced, but they're increasing the monetary supply. Someone just called it, it essentially is when a snake tries to eat itself. And that's a pretty visual picture of the cycle that the government gets into. It's a vicious cycle. It's inflationary. And Larry was pointing to the possibility of hyperinflation. If the government keeps trying to solve its problems by printing, then you become the Weimar Republic. You become, Zimbabwe. It's a terrible thing. And they do it. And in some cases, it has some benefits, but it typically gets out of control. And if you study human behavior, when a government's back is against the wall, they're going to print and try to monetize debt to keep the keep the system going. And I think we're at risk of that, but I don't think we're there fully right now. That's why I don't think we're in a meltdown right now.
So this is interesting, and I totally agree with you, because I think we also underestimate the ability for the government to push this out into the future with the printing of money. But don't you agree, though, there's a line in the sand, which I don't think they know, and we don't know either, to where you continue to do this, and then all of a sudden you look at, oh no, we've overdone it, and now we've lost control of the system. That's my concern.
Yeah, you're exactly right. It's like brain surgery wearing dark-colored glasses. You can't see clearly into the future, and you don't know where the line is to stop. And what happens, Bob, is it's triggered when people lose confidence.
Yes.
The only thing that gives fiat money value is confidence. And when confidence is lost in the good faith and credit of the U.S. government to do what's considered as prudent money or running money appropriately, managing appropriately, nobody wants your debt anymore, and nobody wants your currency. So that's when they've crossed the line. It's when we've lost confidence in them. It's one of the reasons that the replacement for fiat supposedly is a cryptocurrency, because it's got constraint, whereas the government appears to have been thrown off constraint.
You know what's interesting, and of course you also have to consider when you said he wrote this book in 1991, so I'm sure he was working on it maybe during the savings and loans crisis, the late 80s. And that's kind of in the back of his mind. But in talking about there's going to be a banking crisis. And what's interesting go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Bob.
Well, I was going to say, what's interesting to me is that is something that all of this sudden just appeared on the radar out of nowhere, that nobody was watching for. And what's interesting, if you look at the statistics, and I'm pretty sure I'm right on this, during the Great Depression, and you can remember how tough that was during that time of our economy and history. Only 30%. It's not like the whole banking system went down. Only 30% of the banks were insolvent, which is a very small percentage than I think most people realize. So I think when you think about the Great Depression, you think about the whole banking system going down. What do you think he was seeing when he was talking about the banking crisis?
Well, the banking crisis is a function of the fiscal and monetary policy, and what's been caused this current banking crisis is the rise in interest rate. So people had bought long-term debt. The government jacked up the interest rates to try to control inflation, and suddenly it created a balance sheet crisis, because those bonds that the banks had bought were decreasing in value. And so the government has caused both of these problems. Government policy has, and Larry recognized that if people lose confidence in our currency, they'll start withdrawing from the bank. I love the term a bank walk right now, because it's not a bank run. The bank walk is people are slowly looking for alternatives.
Yeah.
And with Apple introducing their new 4.25% interest rate on savings accounts with no minimums, they're adding another dimension of threat to the banking crisis, because depositors are going to move where they're going to get the best deal. And so I think watching for a banking crisis is really, really important. It doesn't take a lot to tip us into a crisis where people walk out. They with a click of the button, they're silently moving their money around now. And our banks can go insolvent, which ultimately means the government will nationalize our banks, which means they'll backstop all deposits, which means they'll monetize more debt, which means hyperinflation comes, in my view.
You know what's interesting is that I think if you take a step back, you really look at this whole banking crisis where two banks went down, and you go, wow, this is a pretty big deal. I mean, if you think about it, I have a client, his company had $2 million sitting in Signature Bank, which was one of the banks that went insolvent. 2 days later, after all that happened, they got a check for $2 million. just easy, no problem. And I think it's it should be an eye opener for everybody in this country. Hey, the federal government just backstopped 100% of these assets of these two banks. That's a big deal.
Oh yeah, and people wonder. Well, they say to themselves, I'm under the FDIC limit. Some people roll their eyes and say, well, I don't even have close to that amount in the bank. I don't ever have to worry about it. What they don't recognize is so many banks have half or more of their deposits beyond the limit in their commercial accounts. And that's where your payroll comes from. And if your payroll is cut off, suddenly it affects everybody. So your savings account may be protected, but the company may not be protected that's paying your salary. And so that's why it creates a crisis of liquidity and solvency. If you compare it to the Great Depression, it was Bernanke who implemented quantitative easing because he was the so-called expert on what caused the problem of the Depression, and it was a lack of liquidity. In retrospect, experts say if they would have just injected federal money into all the banks, none of them would have crashed and could have been over more quickly. Okay, let's suppose that works. Where does that leave us? It leaves us at the mercy of monetary and fiscal policy of the government to do the right thing. And, Larry's book was, don't bet on it. Don't bet on them to do the right thing.
That's right. That's right. This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. Thank you so much for joining me today. I do appreciate it. Chuck Bentley, one of my favorite people to talk to each month, is in studio with me, and we're talking about, is the economy going to implode? Not a tough question, but a little bit tougher to answer because who knows what that looks like. But you can look for the warning signs. You can take the steps to get ready for anything that could happen that could spell big risk to what you are being a steward over that God has given you. Let me also want to give out the great website, crown.org, Crown Financial Ministries. I'm a huge fan of what they do over there. Chuck's the CEO of the company. And also, added bonus is Chuck has written a couple of great books and must-reads in my estimation and you can get more information of those. You can get more information on those books at crown.org as well. Okay, Chuck. So here's could gold be the answer? This is another question that comes up anytime people think about the implosion of the economy, anything happening bad. Should I get gold? And I think you've got to look at the why you're buying gold. Is it insurance or investment? There's a huge difference. Talk a little bit about your feelings about that.
Well, I want to ask you, Bob, you have to give people advice who develop gold fever. What do you tell them? Do you tell them it's an investment or insurance?
I go more from the investment standpoint, and I also, in a small investment, just like anything else you would look at from a diversification standpoint in a portfolio. I don't think we're going back to the gold standard. I don't believe that gold is going to be a currency just because I don't think that the government likes the idea of having something they can't control completely 100%. And I don't believe that they can control gold 100% of the time. So, from the standpoint of getting some good diversification, maybe a 10-15% allocation is reasonable. But that's really the reason that, the way that I look at it. I think too also, Chuck, is that people they look at it from the standpoint of this is what you do if we have a crisis, and they make that decision out of fear, which I'm just strongly encourage people not to make that a habit, because when you go through and you make decisions through your emotional filters, it just doesn't end up coming out great.
Well, emotional-based investing is a bad idea. All the studies indicate that people who have an advisor do better long-term than people who are do-it-yourselfers. And I think the reason is that an advisor helps calm the nerves. An advisor helps people have longer time in the market because they don't just jump around. And most people buy high and sell low.
Yes.
They buy when everybody else is getting in and sell when everybody else is getting out. They have a crowd mentality, a herd mentality, and advisors help against that. But I think either way, whether you look at it as insurance or investment, it's good to diversify. It's good to have some amount of investment in precious metals, in a commodity that tends to increase when the markets are going down. And so I think gold is important. We just need to avoid putting our hope in it, because it ultimately is not going to provide for us. People get scammed all the time when they get gold fever. And unfortunately, they call us and ask us to help or try to explain what happened. But that is a big problem.
Yeah, now tell me this, Chuck. I'm not seeing as much of investing in gold today as a greed factor. I'm seeing it more as in the economy is going to collapse. Hang on to what won't go anywhere. You know, gold's a safe place to have your money. Is that kind of what you're seeing more of?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And people want something they can touch. In the digital world, we all feel so vulnerable. And having some gold is, in my view, something that's in your hand is a good idea. I have another friend who I trust and respect, but he only would buy like a gold ETF or a gold mutual fund, because it's much more fungible. It's much more liquid. You can move it around quickly. But Ann and I bought some gold coins, that non-denominated gold coins, just to have in a safe in the event that we had a currency collapse. Now, in the meantime, they're appreciating in value, but we've got something in our hand in case we need it for a form of currency. I hope we never do, but we do diversify into some small portion of gold.
Well, Chuck, talk a little bit about the last minute or so that we have together. I want to make sure that people know that they can go to crown.org and that there's some great resources there. And y'all have done a lot of good work. Talk a little bit about what they might find and could be of help during these times.
Yeah, thank you. We just updated our website, and it helps people to see exactly what's available. Number one reason people visit our website are to use our calculators, whether they're trying to calculate what they need for a budget or a refinance decision, paying off their debt decision. So those calculators are now front and center. All of our forms for getting on a budget and managing your finances God's way are all there, and they're free. It's easy to get a hold of them, Bob. But thank you so much for your endorsement and support of what we do. We try to help people to build their financial house on the rock, which is exactly what you're trying to do as well.
Chuck, always great to talk to you. Look forward to talking to you next month, and God bless you and your family.
God bless you, Bob. Thank you.
This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. Such a blessing to have Chuck on once a month to get his perspective. If there was ever an authority, I believe this, if there was ever an authority on stewardship, it would be Chuck. And some of the wonderful things that they're doing, and God's using crown.org for, it's just, and as far as stewardship goes, and how to manage that awesome responsibility that we have. Once again, the name of that website is crown.org. This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. If you got a question for me, please go to the website at www.prudentmoney.com and send it in, because we are all out of time. Till we do meet again next time. Keep the faith and have a great rest of the day.
That's all the time we have for today. Questions or comments for Bob, or to find out more great information like what you've just heard, visit www.prudentmoney.com. Be sure to join Bob Brooks again for the next edition of Prudent Money.
Prudent Money with Bob Brooks is sponsored by the Prudent Money Foundation on 91.3.
The Word for Today is excited to announce the new official online home for the ministry of Pastor Chuck Smith and Kay Smith, pastorchuck.org. At pastorchuck.org, you'll have instant access to thousands of hours of verse-by-verse teaching by Pastor Chuck Smith from Genesis through Revelation, and full access to special messages on subjects such as prophecy and much, much more. Also at pastorchuck.org, a full library of great teachings by Kay Smith. and a section where you can read some of Pastor Chuck's books online, all free of charge. So visit the new official online home of the Word for Today and the ministry of Pastor Chuck and Kay Smith, pastorchuck.org.
Dr. Charles Stanley.
I plead with you in Jesus' name to ask Him to forgive you of your sin. I plead with you to place your trust in Jesus to save you right now. He'll change your life. He'll change your eternal destiny.
The teaching of Dr. Charles Stanley on In Touch, helping you grow in Christ every day.
In Touch, weekdays at 12:30, here on KDKR.